there is no version of a life that looks like it does on Instagram. And so that's why I do try to put stuff out there that's like pretty raw and real, just to remind everybody we're all going through things. We are. I think about the fear around like something happening to my children or something happening to me and them not being being without me or whatever. Like, but can I focus on that every day? No, that would be ridiculous.
My mom has stage 4 cancer in her bones and in her breast. My dad's disease was 15 years, he died of ALS. I made a podcast about death, seemed like the thing to do. And if you're sad by all of this, well, you're gonna die too. Happy week, all, or sad week to you all, depending on how you're feeling. Chelsea here. Welcome back to Dying of Laughter, or welcome here if you're new. Every week, we interview comedians and entertainment and wellness experts about the loss of their parents and siblings, and we explore the depths of loss and what that means through a comedic lens. Hello from experience camps. I'm currently in the mountains at experience camps mentoring grieving kids and teens all week. I am so nervous and excited. I'm recording this the night before I go. It is Saturday the 7th, leaving later today, and I will be there through the 14th of August. I can't wait to share the details with you. If this is something that you're interested in, we'll be having the CEO of Experience Camps on our podcast in just a few short weeks, and you can learn more about if this is a fit for you. I will certainly share updates as to what the experience is like after this week. I'll be with grieving teens specifically this year, which is a really big deal. I've normally had littler ones and apples and oranges, right? But I know these teens will be grieving very deeply and feeling the loss in a very profound way. So I both look forward to and am nervous about what that will look like. This week, I'm sharing my interview on yoga magic. My friend Ashley Sondergaard has a wonderful spirituality and wellness podcast called Yoga Magic, and she had me on to talk more about grief and loss. I feel like I don't always disclose a ton of information about myself in these interviews because I really want to focus on my guests, which makes sense, at least to me. Kind of have a pet peeve when podcast hosts talk all about themselves in their interviews. I'm like, but you have a guest. What's happening? Specifically, Ashley had me on after her miscarriage this year, which she generously has opened up about through her Instagram and on her online profiles. I remember her telling me that she was pregnant, and through the Zoom we were having this excited like back and forth about it, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And then she had a miscarriage, and she also shared on her Instagram how she was originally pregnant with twins and lost both of those babies, and she will open up more about this experience in episode 91 of her podcast. While the interview today is mostly focusing on my story, because like I said, I was the guest on hers, we do talk about it at the end of the interview, and I will let her share more about her story. And what better way for her to do that than generously opening up on her podcast? So again, that's episode 91 of Yoga Magic if you would like to learn more about her experience. All right, wish me luck at grief camp. What is happening? Am I nervous? Am I sweating? Am I greasy in the dirt? Am I playing capture the flag? Am I very safely vaccinated and COVID testing, but like still hoping that everything is safe and okay? Am I having diarrhea from camp food up the wazoo? Am I meeting new people from around the state? Who knows? Who knows? Except I will know, and you will know when I send you an update. Oh, and last but not least, if you're grieving or experiencing anticipatory grief of a parent or sibling, shoot me a DM at DyingOfLaughterPodcast. I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear your story. You can share details and or not, but I'm here to listen and support. Have a beautiful week. Get out there, do your thing. Now's the part where I say quasi-comical, unhelpful, inspirational non-quotes. Okay, love you, bye. Yodo, you only die once.
Hello, friends. Welcome to Yoga Magic. I'm your host, Ashley Sondergaard, and we are talking about self-care again, but this time through some harder times, but we're going to keep it light because that's the vibe here. My friend Chelsea Lloyd is on the pod today, and I'm so excited for you to hear from her. She's a babe. Anyways, before we get to that, I want to just express some overwhelm. Perhaps maybe you're feeling this too with a post-COVID world. Whoa, I feel like things got real busy all of a sudden. I just been trying to catch up on life and like see people I haven't seen, book appointments, things that have been pushed off for over a year. And I'm just like, whoa, super overwhelmed. I don't think it helps that it's eclipse season either, but I know I'm not the only one feeling this right now. So if you are too, everybody, gentle reminder from someone who definitely forgot. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to do all these things super fast. Give yourself some grace. Slow down. It's totally okay. We have time. It's funny too, because this eclipse energy, it's very much wild card, right? If you're new to working with eclipse energy, there's just no way to plan or really know what's coming next because it is so wild card. And yeah, I've been feeling that. I've been feeling that all over. If you're new to working with eclipses, and I shouldn't even say working because you're not really working with them, you're really just observing. You're just letting them happen and resting and grounding down. There is a simple way to kind of see how an eclipse is affecting you in your chart. So first you want to look at the eclipse. So this one that's happening today is a solar eclipse in Gemini. See what sign it's in, right? So this is in Gemini. And then find Gemini in your birth chart. Which house is it in? For me, Gemini is in the 3rd house, which is really daily routines. So you can say, okay, Gemini, the energy of Gemini is very much about communication, socialization, storytelling. And the 3rd house is about daily routines. And so if I'm going to observe something right now, I would be observing maybe the stories that I'm telling myself in my daily routines. I'll use this example. I'm totally telling myself that I don't have enough time in my day to get all the things done, but then I go and sit on the Rent the Runway app for an hour and a half. If I could have used that time productively, I don't even want to say productively, but use that time on my to-do list that I had really was excited to tackle, but then just didn't do it, I'd get through everything, right? So being honest, that's how it's hitting me. If you are curious, you want to see, how this is affecting you, I really love Chani Nicholas's app, Chani, Chani, to get these readings, to kind of get the lay of the land for your chart. And she breaks it down in just a really tangible way. So anyways, happy eclipse, everybody. We're going to get through it. We're almost to, July. No, it's just June. It's June. But it's here, and yeah, take it slow. Rest. Rejuvenate. That's why we listen to this show. Okay, friends, let me tell you about my very cool, very funny friend, Chelsea. I say a lot of guests are my friends, and a lot of them are. Chelsea's like a good friend. I really, really love her a lot. We met in the fall around podcasting, and I just love spending digital time with her. We get together monthly to talk about podcasting with some other awesome podcasting boss babes. And she's just helped me a lot in the last couple months through her podcast, through her counsel, through her friendship, through my own grief and loss, because that's her area of genius. I love her podcast, Dying of Laughter, and her real life approach to just really hard things. So Chelsea London Lloyd, she's a comedian, a grief activist who uses humor to help other people cope with their pain. She grew up with 2 sick parents. At age 8, her parents were diagnosed with ALS and breast cancer. Her dad died of ALS when she was 19, and her mom, who lost her own mother to leukemia at 19, currently combats stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, which returned after 17 years in remission. Lloyd volunteers, hosts peer lead grief groups via the dinner party. She mentors a 9-year-old girl whose mom has stage 4 breast cancer via Walk with Sally, and volunteers at Our House Grief Support via their grief camps and groups. First of all, I didn't even know that there were things like this, like grief support and counseling and mentorship and the dinner party, just all of these communities around grief. Chelsea is such an amazing resource if you are struggling with loss, especially the loss of a parent. And she talks a lot about this on this episode, how it's changed over her time, as what her healing journey has looked like, and how humor has helped a lot. So her show is very funny. She's just super funny, and her show interviews some really amazing people who have dealt with grief and loss themselves. So thank you, Chelsea. I'm so happy you're on this show. I can't wait to get into this conversation. A big old thank you to our show sponsor, Simpson & Vale Tea. It's the ultimate self-care moment, a cup of tea. Yoga Magic listeners get access to their over 380 tea blends, and you can use code YOGAMAGIC for 15% off of your first order. And finally, babes, I just put together the most badass guide to building your morning routine based on, of course, your zodiac sign. So if you want that free guide, you want to know what your sign has to do with your morning routine, go ahead, check it out. You'll get more information on upcoming episodes, events by signing up for the newsletter with the link in my show notes. All right, everybody, I love you all. Thanks for being here. Follow along, share some love on Instagram at Yoga Magic Podcast or at ashleysondergaard.yoga. Well, for listeners that are not in the know of Chelsea London Lloyd, she's my friend. We met, when was it, this fall? Like in the accelerator? Man, what is time? And now I have this person, like a couple people that I can go to about all these things that sometimes are podcast related and sometimes they're not. And today, this is not. This is about dealing with grief. And it's funny because I've been I honestly haven't had to deal with a lot of grief in my life, not like you. And now as we're going through this miscarriage, I'm really understanding where this comes from. And so today we're going to talk about grief and humor and all the goodness that you have. Chelsea, can you just tell listeners who you are and about your show and your platform and the things that you talk about?
Yes, here for all of it. And I'm just so sorry about your experience that you're having. And I really appreciated your Instagram posts about it. And I look forward to, I always think that's interesting. Like, yay, I'm excited to talk about, I'm not like that, but I am looking forward to hearing more about what you are going through, because that's a big deal and it's so common and yet still taboo. And yet everyone's situation is different, all the things. So the host in me is going to really struggle with not just asking you a million questions.
I have that problem too. Yeah, I feel it.
Okay. I'm Chelsea. I'm from the Bay Area. I've been in LA for a minute, 8 years or something like that. And I love it here. I'm a comedian, I'm an actress, and I host the podcast Dying of Laughter, where I interview comedians and funny at heart humans in the entertainment and wellness spaces, specifically about their loss of parents and siblings. And in a normal year, I'm doing more commercials, some TV, a lot of stand-up, and it's a little bit coming back, but it's been an interesting transition. And for the past year, I worked at BuzzFeed as full-time talent and then full-time producing grief content. So it's been a fascinating last year compared to what I normally do. But yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk about the sad things and the happy things and the combination of the sad and happy things.
Yeah, you just hit it on the head. The combination. I feel like that's this piece of sadness, of emotions that I don't know that I fully grasped, honestly, until I met you and I started really listening to your interviews and how you talk about these things. A very good friend, and I've used this quote so many times, a very good friend, April Seifert, who's been on the show, has said that our emotions aren't clean. And I just feel like that's so true. You don't just have one emotion. You're not just sad. You're sad about this thing and you're laughing about something else. So as you have decided to talk about grief and about loss with individuals, what have you learned? What big takeaways have you had in these really hard conversations?
I have learned that there's a commonality amongst people who've suffered varying kinds of tragedy in general. And then specifically within the grief space, I've learned that even if you've lost a different family member or in a different kind of way, there's still this overwhelming understanding and connection, which I first realized when I graduated college. My dad had died my freshman year, so I was still recently grieving. I befriended a girl in my stand-up program I was in who had lost her brother in high school in an accident. And it was a completely different circumstance than having lost your dad to ALS, which is what my experience was. And yet it was the first person that I really, really felt saw my pain. And I really thought that was interesting. And it planted a seed that later in life, AKA now, became this podcast of just hey, that situation really, really helped me, even though it was brother versus dad versus a different kind of loss. I hadn't met anyone else that really had been like, wow, I've been through this overwhelmingly depressing and difficult thing. So have you. Let's discuss. And we just like laughed about it. We talked about it all the time. And I just started healing in partial, I mean, from many things and many people, but she was someone that really stuck out to me as part of my healing journey. And so now I really learned that when I talk to so many different kinds of people about their different kinds of loss, we do relate, we do see each other. And even just listening to their stories is healing for me. So I think podcasts, as you know, is such a cool medium. I think it's great that people who might not be ready to talk about it or to share their own journey can still gain value and feel connection from listening to other stories, despite not having necessarily shared their own.
And you, like me, are a really open person. And I think you're right that not everybody is like that. At some point, they may want to open up and communicate and share and whatever. When you talk about, losing your father and your mother having cancer, like, what do the people that don't get it, how do they react?
My mom actually does that. My mom talks about her breast cancer all the time to strangers and not necessarily as much to her closer circles. But yeah, she always jokes about like, she will tell everyone in Costco because she finds it therapeutic.
Yeah.
I think that people who can't relate to it at all are actually good people to hear these kinds of things, because something that's not in your wheelhouse is maybe not something that is presented to you or discussed or in your inner world. So just hearing something that exists, I think, is a good place to start. I don't come to people with an overwhelming reaction like, oh, my mom and she's sick and it's so sad, because then I think that can be more, I don't know, awkward or whatever. But sometimes I will mention, yeah, my mom has stage 4 metastatic breast cancer and it's been a few years. She's in a clinical trial and we're taking it day by day. So I do share things like that, as opposed to like, people ask how my mom's doing all the time. Like, it's a huge question. She's had her cancer for about 5 years now. And so it's really interesting, over time, people are like, is she like, what's going on? How's your mom? Like, is it still really bad? Is it kind of fine now? Like, and people don't know. So I like what you do too, like being honest and not being afraid to just share what's authentically going on, but within a few bullet points. And if people are really intrigued, then you can elaborate further. And if they're like totally thrown off, then, I won't keep going with that.
Totally. Yeah. I do want to know, just when you get into those moments of sadness, those moments of where you're like, I don't want to say victim mentality, but you just are like, why the fuck? Why does this happen? Like, what do you do to take care of yourself?
Love from the self-care queen herself. I think it's important to have a list of things mentally or physically. I mean, hey, huge fan of having a physical list that you post by your laptop, or you have written in a journal, or it can be in the notes app on your phone. Big fan of that. Just having a list of things that can bring you out of yourself, bring you out of a victim mentality, bring you out of a depression. And I'll be really honest, I don't think these things are what solve your problems, but if they can bring you down from that rageful 10 to like a displeased 6, like that's a win, for me. I don't know why I'm so stubborn. Like, I'm very like, this thing is not going to solve how I feel. Like, so I can have some resistance and transparency, but I do acknowledge and admit that these things can bring it down, which is still much, much better. Which is still a much better place to be mentally. So some things for me would be walking. I mean, can't stress it enough. And some of the pelvic floor dysfunction that I have, which is another podcast episode, I've been having pain in my pelvis for many years.
Oh my gosh.
There's often times that walking is the only thing that doesn't hurt. And I was resistant to that for a long time because I'm like, what's the point? It's just walking. But I think in the pandemic, more people have experienced that walking is spiritual as well as physical. So walking around the block, cooking is huge for me. I'm not like the fanciest person, but just the act of creating, it is a form of creation. So even if you're just blending a smoothie, making something from the earth or taking something from the earth and digesting it. So cooking, walking around the block, calling a friend, like sometimes I need to call 3 friends a day. Like I have a lot to say. I have a lot of emotions. I have a lot of shit going on with my mom and whatever else. And so I need to talk to people. So just knowing that that's a thing. And if you can't get a hold of someone, big fan of sending a voice memo. I send voice memos all the time. And
Me too.
it's Ashley, you're like, you've even sent them to me. It's a way to not have the phone tag element of like calling back. It's like, just send them a voice memo and they'll respond back to you on their own time. And even if you can't get a hold of anyone right that moment and you're really frustrated, you just talking something out, the act of sending it to another human who will receive it is mentally helpful. So those are some things that I like doing.
I love the voice memo thing too. Like, would you say you're an extrovert? Is that, or like some form of an extrovert?
Oh my gosh. Yes. And like all of these, okay. I always joke about like anything that's like a thing. I don't know what it is. Like, are you this human design? Are you this number of this? Are you this label of this? I'm just like, I don't know. And I should know all the things. Let's go with yes for extrovert because I do receive energy off of people, but I'm also confused. Like, don't we all need to be alone and like relax? Like, I don't want to be at a rave. So yeah. like I've never been to a rave. I always joke about it. Like seems so fun, but like sounds stressful. So I'm like an extrovert adjacent with neurotic tendencies, in which case I need some alone time. Right? Does that make sense?
I feel like lovely. Honestly though, like it's the same. There's so many different interpretations of a lot of these things. When I think about an extrovert, I think of them as somebody who recharges around other people. So when you're feeling low energy and you're around others, you get energy from them. Does that mean you want to be alone sometimes? Heck yes, totally fine.
Right.
Versus like recharging by yourself, like where you're like, I feel really depleted. I need to be alone.
I do both. I mean, honestly, both of those are so necessary. So like not the sexiest answer, but like, I don't see a world where either of those is mutually exclusive. I'm like, those both are so important.
How about therapy? Do you find that that's been something that's been consistent or helpful? What's your stance on therapy?
Yeah, very important. And yet I feel like no one goes at first and then you sort of go and then all of a sudden you go, that's sort of a lot of people's trajectory. So yeah, I've gone every single week virtually since last March. My career completely changed, huge shifts in entertainment, stand-up acting, everything like completely gone, ways that I made money, just everything was completely different. So it was really just emotionally confusing and stressful, and then being also grateful, but also overwhelmed. So I've been in virtual therapy every single week. I actually found my therapist on BetterHelp, huge fan, completely changed my life. And fortunately for me, the first person I was matched with was an excellent fit and we've never missed a week. I think oftentimes you will have to have trial and error. I think it's like dating. Try 3 or 4. I know it's annoying. You will gain some kind of knowledge from all of them. And hopefully after 3 or 4, you'll find your fit. Now, my original journey with therapy was different, which is why I think virtual is really cool. It's more accessible. It's less overwhelming. It's less of a thing, especially if you live in a city where commute times are crazy. Here in LA, it's a minimum of a 3-hour commitment because it's going to be at least an hour there and back, even if they're 10 minutes away. Yeah, it just is. So that's 3 hours a week, which not everyone has, but virtual, it actually is 1 hour. Like you can be, doing something else up until 5:59 and then start at 6. So big fan of that for anyone who's wanting to dip their toe in, like what a great time to do that. My first experience with therapy was that it was non-existent. Despite being in elementary school with 2 terminally ill parents, I didn't see a therapist. That's just a lot of us didn't because our parents were different. But my dad was diagnosed with ALS. My mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. He was in a wheelchair. Then he was paralyzed. Then he moved out. Then he was, couldn't talk. My mom was bald, chemo. It was definitely stressful and it could be worse. They were they made it work. That sounds like a weird thing to say about illnesses, but they didn't understand that despite me and my sister getting good grades, like perhaps there's emotionally things going on, like, oh, good grades, you're fine. So I wish that I had explored some of those things earlier, like emotional intimacy and things that I've struggled with that I think could be related would have been really helpful to have done as a child. But what is that quote that's like the best thing the best time to have done something was 5 years ago. The second next best time was today. So it's like, yeah, it would have been great to have done something then, and yet you can't. So what are you going to do today? And then when my dad died, when I was in college, did not talk to anyone, was just like, okay, like, I don't know. You just don't know who to go to, and you're young and you don't know, and your friends don't go. So you're just like, okay, I guess it's fine. And then when my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, which had returned 17 years later, I finally was like, okay, I really need to address the pain that I'm feeling around the loss of my dad, of whom I was extremely close to, and talked shop with and talked till our faces fell off until our faces fell off. And I no longer had that person in my life. And I found that I was really ready to actually address the pain of having this sick dad for such a long time and then having lost him. Unfortunately, it was triggered by another illness, which of course made sense because illnesses in general is just, been this recurring theme in my life, for better or worse. And I say that because of course it's for worse, but yet for better in terms of the emotional work I've done around it and been able to hopefully help some other people with their emotional experiences as well. Mm-hmm. So I called a local group in LA, a grief group for people in their 20s. And it's through the program is called Our House, and they're virtual now, and they're a wonderful group. And they have grief groups for people in their 20s. And I was like, well, it's time. And I called them, and it had been 6 years since my dad had died. And they said, well, we only help people for up to 5 years, which made complete sense because you have to draw the line somewhere. And I became really, really interested in not just the fact that I couldn't go, in the fact that it became telling to me that I was so ready and open after 6 years. Well, I can't be the only one who 6, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years after a loss might finally be ready. And yet where are the resources for those people? Because it is a lifelong thing. That person in your life is not coming back, and they will not be here for a long time, especially, being 19 when he lost. I will be on this earth for more years without him than with him. Where's the opportunity to work through that? And there are things that exist. And yet I felt compelled and encouraged to kind of start my own little world, because I figured I need to talk about this often, and I need to talk about this all the time. And I need to talk about this with people regularly. Like, who are these people? And I didn't know. So I became the people.
Have you found that there are a lot of people like in a similar position? I mean, I get the sense that you have. Like, have you built this community around, I mean, grief is lifelong, right? Like, this is a lifelong experience.
Yeah, people will message me. I mean, not a ton, it's a small but growing little world. So it's not like this huge thing as of now, but yeah, it's flattering and beautiful and strange, but people will message me like, hey, my parent just died. What do I do? The most common messages I get are, my parent was just diagnosed. What are your thoughts? Because that's like a really triggering moment. It's the beginning of your grief journey for many. And some people are fortunate and it won't be, and they will come back from their illness and be healed. But for many, it is the beginning of their grief journey. And I will get those messages because I've been through that 2 different times, with both of the parents. So it's just nice to be able to connect with people, online. One of the beauties, there's certainly blessings and curses to social media, but is connecting with other people who are like, hey, my mom just got diagnosed with breast cancer, which unfortunately 1 in 8 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer. Wow. And it's still shocking. I'm fascinated. Like, even though my mom had it before, when it came back, it was absolutely shocking. I was 25. My mind was blown. I was extremely depressed. I couldn't even function. And yet it's extremely common, 1 in 8 women. And if you have it, it is very possible that it comes back, but it's not pleasant to think of life in that way. And my goal is not to be an alarmist and put out statistics so people are scared, but much like what you're doing with self-care and what so many podcasts are doing with their messages, it's just about normalizing some of these darker things, taking them out of the dark, putting them into the light, and it's not funny, but I don't mean to laugh, but it's like crazy that it's so depressing and overwhelming when our parents, you know, something happens to them. And yet all of our parents are going to hopefully die before us. I say hopefully, because if they don't, that means that you died before them. And that's, of course, not what we're going for. So how can we support each other, be there for one another when our parent either gets diagnosed or, you know, I speak with people who have lost parents to homicide, suicide, addiction, not just terminal illness. But how can we just support people and make it a little bit more normal? It's going to happen. We're all going to die. And yet we're terrified and we're confused and we're ashamed. Why?
Yes. Oh, this is when you say it like that. To me, it's really spiritual. I mean, like I'm thinking one of my favorite books is The Other Untethered Soul. And it's this idea that we're all going to die. And life is a shitstorm. Like it really is every day. Like there are so many hard things. And yet, if we live in that constant state of fear and grief and sadness and all the things, and that overwhelms or overcomes us, like what life is that? Hi there. My name is Ashley Sondergaard, and you're listening to an interview I did with Chelsea on my podcast, Yoga Magic. Yoga Magic is a show all about self-care and self-discovery. Thanks to Chelsea for sharing her amazing insight on my show and for sharing this conversation with her listeners. As I touched on in this episode, I experienced loss in the form of a miscarriage this year, and I talked about it in further detail on Yoga Magic. If you're someone listening who has experienced pregnancy loss, please know that you are so not alone, and I'm just a DM away for support if you need it. If you'd like to learn about the specific ways that I worked through the challenging time, my deepened connection to spirituality, and how I amped up my self-care routine, check out episode 91 of Yoga Magic. Thanks again to Chelsea for sharing this episode. It's so much easier said than done, right? Like, holy buckets to just, like, I think about the fear around like something happening to my children or something happening to me and them not being with, being without me or whatever. Like, but can I focus on that every day? No, that would be ridiculous. So this work you're doing is like, oh, it is real. And thank you. Thank you. What are you seeing when you talk to these individuals, all these different people who've had different experiences? Is there a through line? Is there something that you're seeing that's kind of consistent with all of them as they're working through it?
Sure. A positive through line is that after a few years, people do get better. You do move on in the sense that you're not overwhelmed with deep depression every single day for the rest of your life. You don't move on in the sense that, of course, your life will never be the same. And many, many circumstances point to that you are going to be suffering in some capacity for quite a while. But in terms of a positive through line, yeah, after a few years, you do move forward. You do keep going. And that's with any tragedy, not just specific to grief. So perhaps if you're listening and you haven't lost a parent or a sibling, if you've been through something monumental, even a move or a loss of a job or a loss of an experience or a loss of a friendship, certainly breakups, a few years later, you do find your footing again. They say it takes between 1 and 3 years to the point where you're not thinking about the loss every single day. I think my experience was closer to 3. It depends on how close you were to that person and how they died and how much time you had to think about it and how much emotional work you've done before and all these other things. So after a few years, people do pick themselves up. People always say that if they had someone to talk to about it at the time of the grief, that was extremely helpful. But a lot of people also didn't. So if you're listening and you didn't have someone to talk to or you don't, please don't feel isolated. That's extremely common as well. But I think resources, honestly, like podcasts, as well as books and films, and I can drop a few recs at any point. I have recs for all of those, are ways that you can get through it on your own. I got through it on my own and here I am. Another type of loss is the loss of that time. There's times that I don't think about my dad at all, and I have grief around that. And there's times that I can't remember what we did and I can't remember what he said. My dad, interestingly, had become paralyzed by the mid 90s. So interestingly, he does never send a text message. I think about things like that. Like by the time there were cell phones, like he didn't text. So like I don't have texts, I don't have voicemails, I don't have anything besides a handful of photos, which thank goodness. But you think about now, like how many bajillions of pictures you have of like everyone in your life. So that's just interesting. And I've had grief around that. Like who is someone if they're not there, and who is someone if they're not talked about and asked about. And another impetus for starting the podcast was not necessarily the questions people asked me about my dad, but the questions they didn't ask me. And that really interested me. Like, what do we do with that? I understand why it had been 7 years when I first started doing grief work. So that's already a while. Now it's been 10. Why would someone ask? And yet, what can we do to just normalize all of this? That wasn't perfectly tied into a bow, but those are some things coming up for me.
What do you mean when you say the questions that people don't ask? What type of questions are those?
People don't ask about people who died many years ago. The first few months, people are asking a million things. Like the first few months after this monumental loss was like, every person you've ever talked to in your entire life reaches out to you. I mean, there's just nothing like it. It's like, and you get the most beautiful messages. I mean, people from your childhood, people that you didn't even know remembered you, people in your second grade class that say, you had this report about women's rights, and I'll never forget how eloquently you spoke about, things that you're like, wow. And it's beautiful. And yet you don't even have the capacity to fully take it all in, because I remember, like, I posted on Facebook when my dad died, and within like 10 minutes I had like 18 missed, 400. It's like all night it's just going. And then that's the first few days. And then the first few months, it's just like this constant thing. And then after a year or two, no one really asks anything.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like, okay. So I'm a big fan of asking people questions about their past experiences, whether it's pertaining to grief or otherwise. Like, hey, how are you feeling about X? How are you feeling about Y? Like, I would love to ask you how you're feeling in a few years about this miscarriage, that kind of thing. I do take note of, because I know how magical it is for me when someone does really want to ask me about my dad many years later. So my takeaway is putting dates on calendars. Big fan of that. So if a friend or family member in your life has experienced tragedy, miscarriage, loss, anything that's overwhelming or monumental, putting that date in the calendar for yearly or for next year, mark it so that you can bring it up to them, send a small gift, send a nice paperless post email, give them a voice memo or a call on the anniversary of that moment. I think it really, really is special. And things like that are so powerful and overlooked.
Oh, that's beautiful. I've never thought of that. Thank you. I try to like be that person that writes, like birthday cards and, does that stuff. This is way bigger than that. I love that idea. What other resources? You said you have some books and just other great resources. You have all the info.
Big fan of resources. The Dinner Party is a group that is now doing virtual peer-led grief groups. So I lead peer-led grief groups through this organization. It used to be in person. It's really, really great. They're on Zoom. They're specific to your kind of loss or not. You can opt for general grief group about anyone in your life. There's one specific to just parents, loss of both parents, just siblings, loss of dad, loss of mom. Mine is a comedy through grief group. So I'm implementing comedic moments, and we share funny stories about our parents. And it's sort of this lighter, this thing that's related to what my podcast is. But there's all kinds of things. There's ones if you have lost a friend or a best friend, that's very specific, loss of partner. So the Dinner Party is amazing. If you're a one-on-one person, they also have a buddy system. They can match you with someone ideally / not ideally who lost someone specific to the way that you lost yours. And then you're just kind of matched and you go from there. Modern Loss is an online community. They have a great book. This book I would specifically recommend for anyone who is grieving someone, let's say like a teacher or a neighbor. It's short stories. They're all, okay, I'm gonna say it again. Modern Loss is a book of short essays about people who have lost people in their life. Not necessarily the number one rec I'd have for parent or sibling, because most of the stories are a little bit more removed, such as a neighbor, teacher, past person in your life you forgot about, and then they died, and then you saw it on Facebook and you have thoughts. So it's a great intro to anyone who's like, I'm really affected by my drama teacher dying. I haven't talked to her in 10 years, but it's stories like that. It's really, really beautiful. I'm trying to think what else. My favorite book is The Power of Now. It's not specific to grief.
Yeah.
You love that book?
Oh yeah. I'm sort of surprised that you said that, because you said you're like just a little bit, you're one woo. And I feel like that's a woo woo book.
Oh yeah, I think I told Ashley on a previous call, I'm not full woo woo, but I'm a little bit, so I'm woo. That's like the best way I can describe it. But no, I mean, being woo, I'm still fully adjacent to woo woo things. I just, I just like to like balance it out. Sometimes I need to like psychologically understand like why something is. But it evolves and changes. Like my relationship to spirituality has evolved in different ways after losing my dad. He was extremely Jewish growing up. And so what his relationship to God was one thing, but even his relationship changed when he became terminally ill. And interestingly, I'll just share this anecdote. Jewish people are historically not cremated. And there's a correlation with Holocaust, burning in ovens.
Sure.
Like, there's a through line there. There's also a lot of other reasons that I don't have time to get into. B, I don't even fully know what all of them are, but just, historically Jewish people are buried. And my dad, despite being extremely Jewish and going to Hebrew school like 6 days a week as a child, he opted to be cremated because he felt that his body no longer served him, if that's the right word. I mean, I can't put words in his mouth, but ALS, you become paralyzed. So he was paralyzed for over a decade. And we're talking, you can't move a muscle. You can't change the channel. You can't scratch your face. You can't move your head. I mean, in his situation, he was completely paralyzed for a very, very long time. And ultimately, when the muscles are attacked in your vocal cords, that's how you die. Those muscles become paralyzed as well. So he felt that his relationship with his body after many years had changed in such a way that, I don't know, he didn't want his body to be, or it's so personal. I would love to talk to him more about that decision. It was a very brief conversation 10 years ago at this point, but it is something I've thought about. And I think that a gift we can give ourselves is asking our loved ones difficult questions about how they would like to go. Now, this sounds extremely awkward. I have a great episode on my podcast with Liz Eddy, who's the CEO of Lantern, which is an organization that helps you track all of the ways that your loved ones want to go. So I would just say at some point, put in the back of your mind or not, having a conversation with your parents about things like if they would like to be cremated or buried, where they would like their ashes scattered, would they like to be on life support? Do they have a will in place? Do they have their passwords written down for things like their bank accounts, their cell phone bill? I mean, those things are extreme stressors to not have passwords and access to things like money when your person goes. So even if your parent is not sick, and I hope that they're not, I think it's a very bizarre but beautiful way to honor them and to honor yourself by writing a few things, just jotting down a few notes about what their hopes and wishes were, and even doing it for yourself. I'm sure the majority of people listening are young and healthy and not necessarily thinking about this, but what a gift that you can give someone else. And God forbid the worst, something horrible happens to you, that you have clarity on some of those wishes and that your loved ones have clarity so that they feel that they can honor you the way that you want it to be honored.
That is super good advice. My husband works in nursing homes, assisted livings, and long-term care. And so that he's in a total agreement with this, that like we really have to at a young age establish, like, what do you want? Like at some point we're going to become old. and we need to figure that out. And like, yeah. And those conversations, like he set them up on my calendar, like, okay, we're going to look at our will and have this convo. And I'm always like, oh, this is so like the energetics around this is so depressing. I feel like we're manifesting death. And it's like, but duh, it's going to happen. So I shouldn't keep saying duh, but like it is, of course it's going to happen. And like it takes some bravery and some realness to sit down and like have those conversations, and it's going to help in the long run. Yeah, that's great advice.
Absolutely. I love that your husband does that. I mean, and putting in the calendar. I mean, you just have to laugh because you're like, yeah, energetically, I think a lot of people think the energy is low, and to my point about manifestation, it's like, no, we are all going to die, like you said. And so talking about death doesn't mean it's going to happen. And I totally get that because it's very bizarre. And even sometimes me saying things about my mom, like, I don't want to put out like any bad vibes at all. And yet I like to be honest. So I'm glad you're having those conversations. I hope someone listening feels encouraged to do it. You got this, listeners. You can do it. You can DM Ashley or myself. Let us know how it goes. But, we just got to look out for one another and just remember that having these conversations are important. So,
Yeah. Last question. You talk about humor and, comedy and grief. And obviously that's something that you're really good at. How has that helped you? How has that helped others? Like kind of what have you learned through this process of tying them together?
oh my goodness. I love comedy as a mechanism for releasing stress, for telling the truth, for being yourself, for therapy. And I think many others do as well. I've learned that making light of a dark situation is everything. I mean, it's everything. There's truly some moments that are so sad, there's nothing left to do but laugh. And I learned that through my dad. My dad was hilarious. And I think a lot of people feel that about their dads. Like, my dad was so funny. I don't know. A lot of people always tell me that on my podcast. Like, my dad was hilarious. So I don't know if we all just feel that way about our dads, but my dad was always into like practical jokes, like April Fool's Day. Like he was just through and through this weird, funny guy. And throughout his ALS, when he did bring humor to it, I found that he was in a better place. So even when the last year he didn't speak, we would literally point at letters on this like makeshift whiteboard for him to spell out his wants and needs, which now everything is like super technical. There's like lasers connected to your eyes that do it for you. LOL, not funny, but funny. And he would make jokes through that. And it was so uncomfortable. I mean, it would be a great visual for a movie because his face was completely paralyzed, right? Like literally his face did not move. So we're talking, you can't even smile. You can't like have a gleam in your eye, like literally just a stone face. And then I would spell things out. And in our last conversations, I would say things like, and I'm going to be fine. And I'm going to, I'll get married. And, I tried to be like, I'm going to be okay. Or whatever my little teenage self felt like I could muster up. And then he would type out Brad Pitt. And like, that's like, I mean, he didn't have that many, he also couldn't even tell full sentences. So it was just like little words. And you're like, yep, dad, totally. Brad, haha, not funny. Let's laugh. And I just have loved comedy ever since. So I've always appreciated people who have been able to make fun of themselves or make light of situations, right? We've all walked into those rooms that are so stuffy and bizarre and awkward. And then someone just says one thing, we all burst out laughing. It's medicine. It's a way to heal us. It's a way to connect us. And that's why I'm so passionate about it.
You're doing good work, Chelsea. This is hard stuff. Thank you. Thank you for doing it.
There's so many things I wish I could like explain, like all the people I've talked to and what they've said. And I just can't feel like I can fully do it justice, but it's we're on such a beautiful planet and we're all connected. And despite all of the challenges and bizarre differences that we've seen and that we have, we're here one time. What is the one legacy that you hope to have? What is the one gift you hope to give someone else? And on days when I'm really depressed and stressed out, it really does help me just to remember I'm here, I'm alive one time. if I knew I was going to die in 5 years, would I be doing this? If I knew I was going to die next year, would I be doing this? And if that's really dark and doesn't help someone, fair and square. But if it helps, hey, why not?
Mm. Yeah, that's like real motivation, right? To do what do we want to do in this life? I love that. This is Chelsea, this is spirituality. You are like a little Buddha over there.
Definitely no, but Buddha adjacent. Do you ever do that? Like when you get like very stressed out and overwhelmed, like where does your mind go? Do you think back to, there's only one life? Because I didn't used to. Like where does your mind go in those times of stress?
I love this question. It's actually funny that you're bringing this up because I do a ton of meditation and I do a ton of like work with my spirit guides and hypnosis and all these things. And I kind of get the same answer all the time. It's like, Ashley, like your life is really good. You're overcomplicating things. You need to just really look at what you have and be grateful and sort of like enjoy the sweetness of what you have in this life, because it's a gift. I mean, even the crappy stuff, like when I did a past life regression before we lost the babies, and I kept getting it over and over again the message that like even when stuff is really hard, it's still really good. There's still a lot of good things, but you have to make that conscious choice, right? It's like it's life design in a way. You design that. So I think you and I see it in like these different worlds, but it's very much the same thing. It's like we're so lucky to be in a human form. Let's use it.
Absolutely. I love that so much. How have you been feeling since you shared a few weeks ago about your miscarriage? What was it like publicly sharing that? What has been the response, and how are you feeling?
Mhm. I think for me it was a no-brainer that I'd want to share, especially as it relates to something like miscarriage, because it's this like weird solo grief that like there honestly is some blame around. Like as much as like I don't blame women, I think society just by not talking about it inherently blames mothers, and I think that's fucked up. So I wanted to talk about it and just let other people know that like we're all dealt stuff, and self-care obviously is like my platform. It makes it more bearable. You're talking about that like 10 to 6. Heck yes. Like that's it, right? Like if taking 5 minutes to breathe and meditate gives me a little bit of solace, then yes. Is it going to make me feel totally healed? No, that's not a reality, but like it does help. So it's been really, really good. The response that I've gotten is extremely positive. If there's been any, you know, feedback that isn't positive, it's just that I should have probably told some of my family members, like some of my more extended family members before I told like social media. And that's a lesson I learned. But again, like sometimes you're not thinking clearly when you're in these moments of grief. I've never been through this before. So I don't know. I don't know what the right way to do it is. I just try to like follow my intuition and follow my heart. And we never told my daughters that we were pregnant. We never officially told them. They're flipping little psychic. So they knew like the second that we were pregnant, Mommy, there's a baby in your belly. And when they were gone, I just said, mommy's really sad. Mommy's really sad. And I think talking about being sad to other people and to your family and to your kids and normalizing sadness is a huge healing and the huge realness to this process. So I like to be really open as much as I can while still respecting other people at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I'm really glad that you did share that. I've had 3 friends who've had miscarriages in the past year, and all have remained private in different ways. And I just want to I fully respect that. And I'm like, can I connect you? Like, do you want to talk to this other woman? It's, and everyone's on their own journey with it, but I just appreciated that you shared that. And I actually DM'd that to a few people that I knew who also had a miscarriage and were being private about it. So it's really healing in ways that, yeah, you might not even realize. I definitely sent that. It was like, hey, this is my friend, just wanted to send this. And they're like, thank you for sharing that. And,
thank you.
It's nice that you're able to put yourself out there in that way, because it might make someone else feel more comfortable doing the same or, provide that relief privately, which we were kind of talking about at the beginning.
I think you and I both, right? Like the purpose is to help others through this process while kind of at the same time healing ourselves. Like it's a two-way streak.
I wonder what your relationship like with miscarriages as a mother. And I'm wondering if anyone else brought that up.
Like at the already having children that are earthbound here. Yeah. Most of the time it's like you hug your little girls, right? It's like recognize what you have. And I don't, some people might take that as, I don't know, they might take that the wrong way. I take it as like, you're totally right. Like be like power of now, right? Like I have these two beautiful children, and I'm really present with them. And I'm so grateful that they are here. But no, I think that like people all they have like good intentions when they say that. And everyone is just so different how they interpret these things. And I think that's why it is hard to talk about this stuff, is because you may have good intentions and you also may say the wrong thing. You know, you really will. That's why I love Nora McGurney. Like, I love how she talks about that. Like, you still have, you know, people say the wrong thing all the time, but at least they're saying something, you know, and I'm in agreement. Yeah.
And there's something to be said about acknowledging people's truth and acknowledging people's tries. You know, it's like, I think a lot of people sometimes feel that if they say something, it'll be worse if they say the wrong thing, but we're all human and we have to support each other in our evolution of trying to talk about difficult things and whatever that looks like. So
I remember what I was going to say. Okay. So I think this is an outcome of social media, is that another reason I really wanted to share is because a lot of times I'll get people that will say things like, oh my gosh, your life is so beautiful. You're so lucky. You have these kids and like, you know, the house and the, like all like things that we show on social media, right? To make our lives look perfect.
yeah.
And no one's lives are perfect, right? There is no version of a life that looks like it does on Instagram. And so that's why I do try to put stuff out there that's like pretty raw and real. Just to remind everybody, we're all going through things. We are.
Absolutely. I think you do a really nice job of striking that balance. Social media is a whole other, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but my favorite word around social media, I say this on podcasts all the time, is balance, you know, like that's what comes up for me. I'm like, balance. It's beautiful for connection. A lot of us have businesses on there. It's here to stay. It's an important tool. And the comparing is real. The anxiety is real. The cortisol levels rising when you see something is real, especially early in the morning. So the word balance is my favorite thing with social media. Set your timers, you know, don't beat yourself up. Remind yourself that everyone is, you know, projecting their best selves. And yet as many times as I remind myself, like I forget literally every day.
I know.
Every single day I see something and I'm like, oh my gosh, it must mean this. I literally forget every single day. So balance is helpful, and having days where you don't go on at all. Like, I think it's not realistic at this point. Some people, you know, when their advice is like, I just don't go on anymore. I think that's really wonderful. I'm super jealous. Bless up. But if you are on and it is a part of your world, like, can you have days where you don't go on? Because I noticed when I was tracking my screen time, which you can do on your iPhone, which is fascinating, how much time I did spend was really helpful. Because I was like, whoa, that's actually nuts. And granted, being at BuzzFeed for a year didn't necessarily help because I had to actually go on to track stats and things like that. But now I'm like, cool, maybe a couple days a week I don't go on. Even if it's just Sunday, you don't go on. Or even if you just don't go on from 9 to 5. Or even if you set the timer and just start, you just don't go on for 2 hours a day. Like, okay, cool. I consciously will not go on from 1 to 3 p.m. Great. I think that's helpful. I think that's lovely, you know?
Yeah. When I'm sad, sometimes I watch one of your, I think it's a reel or a video about peeing your pants. And I like literally like, I love that one.
Oh my gosh. Oh yeah. I remember you. Thank you. You reshared that. No, that was, because I have pelvic floor dysfunction, which is another podcast episode that we are figuring out all the time.
Do that.
I, on occasion, pee my pants. And there was one time that I filmed it. And of course that went viral because that was so bizarre and yet authentic. I don't know. That was my authentic moment. It was actually mortifying though. And I had to drive home from San Francisco and it was horrible, but hey, gotta laugh. Glad it's
lots of joy over here. Chelsea, can you tell listeners how to find you, find your show, all the goodness?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Ashley. I'm on Instagram at Chels Who Else. So that's like Chels. Who else would it be but Chels? My name is Chelsea London Lloyd. You can Google that way. My show is the Dying of Laughter podcast. I would love to see you over there if you're grieving. And I'm also on Instagram at DyingOfLaughterPodcast. DM me if your peeps are getting diagnosed or want to chat. I'm happy to weigh in or just listen and all of the things.